Hello, this is Sunny Chayes, and you are listening to KCLA, and I have an awesome guest today who I want to bring to you. His name is Adam Winkler. He is a professor of law at UCLA. Adam is an expert on constitutional law, and he has been on the BBC airwaves as well as NPR, MSNBC, CNN, and many other news shows discussing Citizens United, which is a whole other issue which we will discuss another day, but he is also most recently discussing the Second Amendment and clarification about that. And so I want to just bring him right to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to just kind of illuminate our listeners about the Second Amendment, and then we can also maybe get into some ideas you might have about the way of controlling gun laws and the way we move through our lives here in America and with the balance of guns. So, hi, welcome.
It's a pleasure to be talking guns with you.
So let's start out by maybe clarifying a little bit about the Second Amendment and what it actually means.
Sure. Well,
perhaps what it meant originally and then what it sort of means now.
The Second Amendment is famous for its ambiguous wording. It provides a well-regulated militia, comma, being necessary to the security of a free state, comma, the right of the people to keep and bear arms, comma, shall not be infringed. And it's almost as if James Madison, the author of that provision, had just discovered this wonderful new thing, the comma, and wanted to put it in there as many times as possible. And in part because of those commas, that language has bedeviled Americans for generations. Nonetheless, I think that the best interpretation of the Second Amendment in terms of our history and tradition and the founding purposes, well, is to recognize an individual right to bear arms. Virtually every single one of the other provisions in the Bill of Rights protect an individual right. Indeed, the language of the right of the people, one way to interpret that, and some people have argued that the best way to interpret that is that it doesn't protect an individual right, but it protects a collective right, a right of states to form militias free from federal interference. The only difficulty, well, there's several difficulties with that. One of the difficulties with that argument is that the framers used the right of the people in the First Amendment to refer to petitioning government for redress of grievances, and we interpret that to be an individual right. The Fourth Amendment says the right of the people to be secure in their homes, etc., from unreasonable searches and seizures, and we understand that to be an individual right. It would be weird to think that all the other amendments protect individual rights, but the Second Amendment, even though it uses the exact same language in the First Amendment and the Fourth Amendment, does not. It was almost as if the framers would have had to have used the same exact wording to mean something totally different. And that's not generally how we interpret a constitution. And even though there's controversies over the Second Amendment, one of the things I discovered in researching my book, Gunfight, was that the right to bear arms in America has never completely depended on the Second Amendment. Every one of the 50 states has its own state constitution. 43 of those states provide for an individual right to bear arms, clearly apart from any service in the militia. And many of these provisions go back to the founding era. And when the framers of the 14th Amendment, adopted after the Civil War to protect the rights of the freedmen, put that provision in, they were thinking of, and were very clear and explicit about it, there's really no historical argument about this, that they thought that the 14th Amendment would protect the right of the freedmen to protect themselves with guns against marauding white racists in the South, like the KKK, who were determined to return them to slavery. So I think that the best interpretation of the Second Amendment is that it protects an individual right to bear arms.
Okay, so now at this point, excuse me, we have this, and there have been cases and a bit of actually, I'd like to talk about the NRA, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about the NRA, and I found it really fascinating in your book to realize in 1870, when it was first coming about, that it was really about something completely different than it is now, that it was really for public safety and personal safety and sportsmanship.
Exactly. The NRA was formed by two former Union soldiers right after the Civil War. And their idea was that the reason why the war had gone on so long, despite the fact that the North had greater resources and greater manpower, was that the Southern soldiers, the Confederate soldiers, were more adept with firearms. They had more familiarity, they had used them growing up and as kids, and a lot of the guys fighting in the Union Army came from urban areas, the cities of the Northeast that were growing at the time, and didn't have much familiarity with firearms. And so they wanted to train people to how to use, civilians to use guns, because they knew in the next war it would be important that people be trained. And the Second Amendment was furthest from its mind. In fact, for most of the NRA's history, they never even talked about the Second Amendment. If you go back through the NRA's signature publication, The American Rifleman, as I've done, go through the decades of the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, you can go through every issue. You won't find a single mention of the Second Amendment. Today, you read that magazine, the Second Amendment is listed on almost every other page.
Interesting. Well, and what I loved when you were explaining about what you just said about the northern guys not really having the mad skills that the Southerners had, that it was really about sort of getting to it and doing it. In other words, if there's going to be a war, I mean, there's so much more unnecessary bloodshed because of this sort of bumbling or inability to be skillful. And so, I mean, again, I'm feeling that, good night, I mean, we're in this era and that we're still doing this kind of just medieval, even earlier than medieval, system of conflict resolution, but here we are. But at that point, that was what was happening, and yet, it would have been sort of like a doctor, being more laser instead of making a mess of the situation.
Right, and the NRA, now known as a die-hard, no compromises opponent of gun control, wasn't always that way. In the 1920s and 1930s, for instance, the NRA was promoting gun control laws, restrictive laws to bar people from carrying guns on the streets without a license, and then restricting that license to people who had a good reason to carry a gun, like they have been threatened in some ways. But all that really changed in the NRA in the 1970s. The NRA had supported the federal gun control laws of 1934, 1938, and then 1968 again. And this angered a group of hardliners in the membership. And the NRA leadership, which was pretty moderate at the time, fired all of the hardliners who had this absolutist view of the Second Amendment, and were planning on moving headquarters to Colorado Springs and retreating from political activity. These hardliners took over the organization at the annual membership meeting in 1977, manipulating the rules of order to replace the entire board with all new hardliners who are committed to an absolutist view of the Second Amendment. So the NRA really becomes what we know today, literally overnight.
And that's what a lot of people don't realize, I think, that there were really reasons for the gun control to be a little broader, and then also the Ku Klux Klan you were talking about, and sort of how that played into the situation.
One of the most interesting things I found in writing Gunfight was the close relationship and disturbing relationship between racism and gun control over the course of American history. The founding fathers who wrote the Second Amendment, they had gun control laws. One of their gun control laws, one type of gun law they had, was racially discriminatory gun laws that barred slaves and free blacks from possessing firearms. After the Civil War, the KKK, America's most notorious racist organization, forms in part with gun control as part of its key agenda. The story there is that in the South, before the Civil War, blacks were never allowed to own guns. But something happens during the war. Many blacks escape slavery and go fight in the Union Army. The Union Army allows them to keep their guns when they're done with the battle, and so they bring those guns home with them. And then other African Americans who are tasting freedom for the first time because of the Emancipation Proclamation, they go out and buy a gun because they think they need it to protect themselves against racist whites. And indeed, they're right, because after the Civil War, white racists determined to reestablish white supremacy start forming these posses and going out at night. They take different names in different places, but the name that sticks for most of them is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. And their goal, obviously, is something broader than gun control. It's to reestablish white supremacy, but the key way to do that is by taking away the guns of the African Americans. If blacks were disarmed, they couldn't fight back.
That's it. That's right. And then, as we know, luckily things slowly with civil rights and all of the different extremely brave and beautiful and amazing, African Americans and black people who sort of changed the climate slowly. And then we have the Black Panthers, and I found that aspect of your book really fascinating. So let's chat about that for a minute.
Oh, it is one of the most dramatic stories in the history of guns in America. Is a day in May in 1967 when a group of Black Panthers decide to take over the California state capitol. And so they go to Sacramento, 30 Black Panthers with loaded shotguns, pistols, and rifles, and they walk right into the front door of the California State House. And it's not illegal, and there's no security at the front doors. and no securities at the front doors, and they walk right into the legislative chamber while it's in session. And they're not there to take hostages. They're there as part of a political protest because the California legislature is considering a law that day that's going to disarm the Black Panthers. And that law was proposed and supported by the state's Republicans, the conservative Republicans in California. Most notably the governor, Ronald Reagan at the time. And they supported giving California the strictest gun control laws in the nation as a way of trying to disarm the Black Panthers. And indeed, there were a lot of people who saw the gun control laws passed in the late 1960s as motivated in part by fear of black radicals with guns. Malcolm X had his gun and posed for a famous photograph in Life magazine, the idea was by any means necessary. Well, no one who saw that picture of him with that rifle had any doubt what he meant by any means necessary. It was the gun. And many black radicals thought that by having guns they'd be able to protect themselves against a racist elite. And that racist elite wanted to make sure that they did not have guns.
Well, what I want to mention about also, thank you for sharing that, and the beginning, sort of the genesis of the Black Panther idea, which is just rocking to me. I mean, so let's talk about that, about the KKK coming into the police situation and how they were really policing the police. I love that. And
it's a great story. I mean, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, as its full title was formed by two young men, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, in the mid-1960s. They were living in Oakland, and they were very disillusioned, and they thought that it had been 10 years since the Brown versus Board of Education had been decided, but equality remained very elusive. And a lot of African Americans, especially ones in the inner city, like Oakland, thought that the police were racist. They were more interested in hurting African Americans than helping and serving them. Of course, that was very much the case in the South, where police organizations tended to be the homes of the KKK. You go to a police station to pay your KKK dues in many towns in the South. I mean, there's always a very close relationship. And so a lot of African Americans thought they needed to arm themselves to protect themselves against racist whites. It's part of the genesis of the Black Panthers, but it even goes back to Martin Luther King. Many people don't know this, but Martin Luther King, before he fully embraced the Gandhian principle of nonviolence, went out after his house was firebombed in the 1950s, tried to get a concealed carry permit so that he could carry a gun to defend himself. And many people over the years who visited Martin Luther King said that even though he wasn't carrying guns, he was always surrounded by people with guns. And it makes sense, because he couldn't rely on the police to protect him. They were the racist he needed protection from. So there was a long intertwined history there, and radicals like the Black Panthers and Malcolm X, they thought, you know what, we need guns to protect ourselves from that.
Well, and in the book, when you were explaining, I'm getting this visual of these Black Panther people driving around and sort of following the policemen, sort of trailing them, and then they're witnessing a policeman being completely unjust to another black person, African American, and they're there to, be, as we were saying earlier, police a policeman, and not in any violent way, but
That's right. They
I'm here to school you. Like, that's not legal and that is legal, and they really knew the rights. They really knew, you explained so beautifully.
Huey Newton had gone to law school, and he had learned this stuff, and he understood that if you followed the letter of the law, then you couldn't get in trouble.
Right.
And that having the oversight of Black Panther patrols, which is how they sort of made their name, the Black Panthers. The initial thing that they started doing was sending armed guys out to follow police officers as they patrolled in Oakland. And if the police officers would harass an African American, the Panthers would be standing outside with their guns in their hand, pointed straight up in the air or straight down at the ground, even though it was loaded. Under California law, Huey Newton had learned that that was perfectly legal, and that it was not considered a non-threatening possession of the firearm. And so you can imagine the police didn't really like this very much. And so they were the ones who persuaded conservative Republicans in the California state legislature to pass a gun control law, barring the Black Panthers and others from carrying loaded guns on the streets. The police didn't want to have anyone following them around and standing up to them.
Right, And again, I just think that it is an incredible sort of genesis. And then, of course, the Black Panthers were taken over, and the sea changed, and it did end up being much more violent organization. But again, the beginning, just, you know, for our listeners to really know. And again, I want to remind people to get the book Gunfight. And we are speaking to Adam Winkler here, because it is filled with so much information.
One of the things I want to get across with the book too, which is I think it's important to know that as we're thinking about policy change and thinking about gun control in the wake of Newtown, we're often hearing people from the NRA and others saying that these proposals for background checks or restrictions on high-capacity magazines, those things are all unconstitutional infringements of the Second Amendment. We're going to protect our Second Amendment rights. One of the things I discovered in reading my book is that it seems like the NRA really doesn't know a lot about the Second Amendment, and it doesn't seem to be following what the courts are saying these days, because there's been a lot of court decisions on the Second Amendment and on the right to bear arms, and what we see is a consistent pattern that says that you can keep felons and the mentally ill from having guns, and you can pass things like background checks to make sure that you're not giving guns to the wrong people, and you can restrict dangerous and unusual weapons, and indeed we restrict. No one would say you can have a shoulder launch missile. No one would say that you can have well, I should say no one would say you can't have a machine gun. There's actually plenty in the gun rights community who say you should be able to have a machine gun. But those laws are clearly constitutional. It doesn't infringe the Second Amendment. And the Supreme Court has suggested as much, that you can ban machine guns and you can ban dangerous weapons. And in fact, we pretty much effectively do ban machine guns already. So.
Well, and also you explain, and it shows the history of it, that there really were gun controls in place from the very, very beginning. And it was also, I believe it felt to me that it was also cultural. In other words, everyone was accepting of these controls. It just made sense.
That's right, and indeed sometimes you hear it said, well, we should treat the Second Amendment exactly like we treat the First Amendment. That's a complicated question, because the First Amendment has so many different doctrines and so many different ways in which it approaches legislation. I think actually probably the way to think about it is more like the right to vote. The First Amendment is different from the right to bear arms, because everyone enjoys freedom of speech, and the Supreme Court has said that it's inconsistent with the First Amendment to say stop the mentally ill from speaking, or people who have criminal convictions from speaking. They don't pose a threat by their speach. But the court
even people who are speaking about pornography or things that maybe some people would find offensive. It's still allowed.
And with the right to bear arms is more like the right to vote, where we don't allow everyone to vote. We require you to be a citizen. We require you to be of a certain age. We only let you to vote. We'll let you vote once. We restrict the right to vote, because that's part of how we understand that right. Because you can exclude people from it. You can have registration, for instance, and force people to go register to vote before they vote. And while I'm not necessarily a proponent of instituting a registration scheme for guns, although it could have some good beneficial public policy effects, I don't think that measures to try to keep the people who are officially excluded from the Second Amendment, like mentally ill people and felons, drug abusers and whatnot, I think we can have laws that keep them from getting guns, or at least do everything we can to keep them from getting guns.
And I want to get to some really current information, but I also did want to mention that you do bring up the Wild West, and I love that you brought that up, and really, again, kind of dispelling some myths that we have, as well as the 1920s and 30s with the gangster. But specifically,
it was really, I mean, the Wild West period was so fascinating, because it's sort of the heart of America's gun culture, is the Wild West, and we have this image in our mind of the gunslingers coming through town with 6 shooters on each hip, a rifle in their hand,
and then everybody else having guns too.
Duels night and day, and high noon. But it turns out nothing could be further from the truth. First of all, gun violence was very rare in these Wild West towns. They averaged less than 2 murders a year. And one of the most surprising things about these Wild West towns is that they all had very restrictive gun control laws. Dodge City, Kansas, Tombstone, Arizona, Deadwood, these are the notorious gun havens of the Wild West, but it turns out that they had the most restrictive gun laws in the nation. When Dodge City residents first formed their municipal government, you know what the first law they passed was? A gun control law. In Tombstone, they barred people not only from carrying concealed weapons, but also carrying open weapons. You couldn't carry your guns around like we see in the John Wayne movie. And those laws weren't enforced because sheriffs wanted to maintain order. You know, these towns were not places, all places of debauchery, although certainly there was plenty of debauchery and drunken disorderly conduct. But if you were a small town on the edge of civilization, you wanted to become a bigger town filled with civilized people. And you do that by attracting businessmen and good families to put their roots down. Who's going to do that if there's shootouts all the time? So, and indeed, we often think about something, there were shootouts occasionally in the Wild West town. The shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, famous shootout. 3 people were killed, 4 people injured. But we don't ask, and we sort of think that that's typical of the Wild West. But in fact, exactly the opposite. The reason why we're still talking about the shootout at the OK Corral 130 years later is because it was such an unusual event. It was an exceptional event. It made headlines across the country that 3 people died in a shootout. People couldn't believe it. Can you believe there was a shootout in a Wild West town that 3 people died? So our understanding of that whole period is so off. The Wild West was a place of gun control, not just a place of guns.
Well, I love that when I was reading all of this, again, it renews my faith in human nature in a way, because I'm reading these things and I'm thinking all of this does really serve the community. And again, I know that can very well be an area of balance in a government, the government of the United States of America, balancing out the individual's right as well as the communal good. And so that's kind of where we are now. I mean, let's just talk about that, because that seems to be where we are.
It seems that we have begun a new chapter in the gun debate. I think it's still too early to tell exactly where that chapter is going, but look, the president has avoided talking about gun control religiously for 4 years, and now all of a sudden he's making it a centerpiece of his agenda. I think Newtown has changed a lot of things and how people think about this problem, and realize that it has gotten to an intolerable point, that too many people are dying from guns to just sit here and let the NRA say, no more, you can't do anything, there's nothing you can do except more guns. And so I think people have changed. I don't know if it's going to lead to legislation. I think it's very controversial. Washington is so dysfunctional right now. I don't know if we're going to see new laws passed there. Probably see some new laws passed at the state level. I think it's possible you get something like universal background checks through Congress. I think it's unlikely you get some of the other things like a ban on assault weapons. That's a non-starter for many people on the right, because these weapons are they think the ban is really a foolish ban because it targets just specific weapons by the way they look, really, rather than by how dangerous they are. And also, it's sort of those assault weapons are very popular in the gun community. They're the most popular rifle around. So I think it's going to be hard to ban those. But it does seem like we may have turned a new page, started a new chapter, if you will, if I can continue with the metaphor, and we'll have to see where it goes. I do think that the gun control movement is more invigorated today than I've seen in my lifetime.
And that is Adam Winkler, and thank you, Adam, for leaving us on such a positive, up note. And I just really enjoyed his book so much, Gunfight, The Battle Over the Right to Bear Arms in America. What I loved about this book so much is that I learned things that I didn't even know I didn't know. I mean, it really is that important. So it is that time of the day, and enjoyed so much being with Adam and bringing his message to you again. Check out his book, and be with us next time on Singing in the Rain. This is Sunny Chayes, and we just love to have you. So my website, sunnychayes.com, has all of my players on there, so you can just check all that stuff out. So until next time, bye for now.